Now that we're officially into Phase 5 of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, there's been a lot of discussion about how Phase 4 was an unprecedented failure compared to the relative success of the first three phases. While I think there is some debate to be had about just how bad Phase 4 actually was, it can't be denied that there was definitely a lack of the cohesiveness and sense of a perpetually developing story that was all leading to something bigger that made the pre-Endgame stuff so engaging. I won't presume to know why this happened beyond saying that it was going to be downright impossible for anything to follow the success of Endgame, but what we got over the last few years was definitely lacking exactly what made us eagerly tune in to each previous chapter in phases 1 to 3: character development and consistency. I would argue that the lack of care for the characters' arcs and their development is what led to Phase 4 and now 5 feeling disjointed and disconnected. Nowhere is this better illustrated than in the handling of the character of Wanda Maximoff and her arc in Phase 4. Hers is the prime example of a once solid story arc being ruined by inconsistency in subsequent appearances. And it's a real shame because I think she was by far the most interesting post-Endgame character. And I say that not only because I may or may not have poorly attempted to flirt with Elizabeth Olsen at an NYU party for the brief time we overlapped, but also because the arc she was started on in Wandavision was so compelling and real for a comic book show, and that missed opportunity perfectly encapsulates the symptoms of the lack of care for the development of all of the characters that was the trend that ultimately ruined Phase 4 as a whole. And action. What's up, everybody? My name is Max Kinchin. I'm an occasional screenwriter and filmmaker, and far more often film talker about her, and this is a kitchen sink production. Up. Come here. Well, Doug's here too. He's a little shy of being on camera, but we'd both love it if you could like and subscribe. We are a new channel, and this is how we get off the ground. And today we're talking Marvel. With Marvel's Phase 5 officially having been kicked off, and Phase 4 being seen by most fans as a bit of a failure, I want to take a look at how we got here character-wise. I think the biggest problem with Phase 4 was that we got a lot of character appearances and cameos and stuff, but unlike Phases 1, 2, and 3, every time we saw a character on screen, it didn't really feel like it was another chapter in that same character's development. And don't get me wrong, there were certainly some highlights in Phase 4, like WandaVision, Loki, Spider-Man No Way Home, but I think what we were all missing when we tuned into each Marvel offering was that feeling that everything you were watching was another chapter in the same story. Instead, it kind of felt like a cameo fest, like, oh, here's this character, oh, here's this character, but you didn't really feel like every time you saw them, they were developing in their arcs, and they were, moving forward towards the larger story goal, which was what was so impressive about Phases 1, 2, and 3 and getting into Infinity War. So today I'd like to take a look at Wanda Maximoff's arc in particular as a prime example, if not the example, of how her arc was mishandled in Phase 4 as the ultimate symptom of Phase 4's biggest problem. I remember walking out of Avengers Endgame feeling like the story was over, and I was actually very okay with that. I remember feeling like I had just witnessed a once-in-a-lifetime cinematic feat and thinking that maybe I didn't need to watch future Marvel content because the story I'd just spent 10 years watching was over, and the conclusion to the 20-movie Infiniti saga was just about as satisfying as it could have been. Then we started to hear about the plans for the post-Endgame MCU, and I'll be honest, I was intrigued, if only to see how they could possibly continue the story after such a Herculean narrative feat. Originally, we were supposed to get a slate of movies of Black Widow, Eternals, and Shang-Chi before any of the TV shows were to come to Disney+. And actually, WandaVision was supposed to come out after Falcon and the Winter Soldier. Of course, the pandemic happened before any of that could materialize, and the first piece of post-Endgame MCU content we wound up getting after a prolonged COVID delay was WandaVision in January of 2021. And I have to say, editorially and for the sake of the overall arc of the MCU up to that point, I'm actually really glad WandaVision was our first return to the MCU after Tony snapped Thanos out of existence once and for all. Whether intentional or not, it was the perfect thing to come out after Endgame, or it should have been. We had just witnessed the end of a universe-wide disaster, and our heroes had all endured unspeakable traumas in order to save the universe. With the arrival of WandaVision, it sure seemed like Kevin Feige had gotten the memo that maybe the smartest thing to do after saving the universe was to go smaller, more character-driven and grounded. Wandavision and Falcon and the Winter Soldier sure seemed to be leading us in that direction. With maybe the exception of Hawkeye, Wanda gets the shortest end of the stick at the end of Endgame, so it makes sense that we'd finally examine the consequences and effects of those traumatic events through her dealing with her grief of losing Vision. It also seemed like a super smart and bold choice to actually show the personal fallout for such insane events as Infinity War and Endgame for someone who had been the most affected by them, and have the conflict be primarily about dealing with grief as opposed to going on a hero's journey. WandaVision was poised to be the perfect answer to the question of, the Avengers just went through the life-altering trauma with literally the highest stakes imaginable and managed to pull out a victory, saving literally trillions of lives at great personal cost. What effect must that have had on their psyches? Daring to explore such a concept would be such a humanizing and grounding exploration that would give a character like Wanda a depth and realism we'd never really seen on screen or in comics. And I think on its own, WandaVision was the perfect answer to that question. Where we ran into trouble was when they tried to continue her story after it, but we'll get to that. In my opinion, WandaVision handled its task masterfully. It created a really unique bit of comic book media with a fun mystery that was informed by Easter eggs and clues, making each episode must-see viewing. Once you kind of caught on to what was going on, the intrigue ramped up, and the final reveal that this was all Wanda doing the absolute wrong thing to deal with her grief was heartbreaking, beautiful, and poignant. Yes, we did have a big Marvel CGI fight in the last episode, but this was so different than most other Marvel stories because it was entirely a character-driven story about Wanda coming to grips with her trauma and the unfathomable loss she suffered, dealing with it in the wrong way, realizing that, and then trying to make amends and accept at least some consequence for what she had done. By the end, she knows she did wrong, and that her loss is not an excuse for what she did. Wanda started out so damaged and hurt at the beginning of WandaVision that she literally created her own reality where Vision was still alive and they are safe and happy in a simpler time where none of that crazy Thanos stuff ever happened. She had to shield herself from the trauma she faced watching her husband die and then being blinked out of existence, only to be brought back to find that everyone but Vision had been brought back. That's going to require us learning some serious coping techniques regardless of how powerful a mutant you might be. Enslaving the town obviously was the wrong way to handle it, but what made it work so well was how plausible it seemed for her character to handle things this way. We could totally believe that this is what she would do, and while we don't justify it, it was completely sympathetic and her actions were understandable, wrong and devastating as they were. This was the deepest and most complicated the character had ever been. She's a good guy who did something truly terrible because she's been through a deep personal trauma and had no other mechanism to deal with it. Even more, once she realizes that this was not an okay coping mechanism, she did what she could to rectify it and try to make it right. She's not redeemed at the end of WandaVision, but she's realized her mistake and is trying to be better as she continues to try to heal from the still very real pain that she's in. The Wanda at the end of WandaVision is damaged and still struggling to recover, but she's made a huge stride and is trying to point that recovery in the right direction. Has she fully made the turn from witch who literally enslaved thousands of people for her own means? Not entirely, but you get the sense that at the end she's contrite and doesn't want to be that person anymore. Intention is key for this kind of recovery. So the ambiguity of the ending of WandaVision left her next phase wide open, and I was really excited to see where that version of Wanda was going to end up after she left Westview. What Wanda would we be seeing in Multiverse of Madness? So for all this really smart and nuanced development for her character, the Wanda that we wound up getting in Multiverse of Madness was nothing more than a one-note scary villain who seemed to have forgotten all of the lessons she had learned about herself and her grief by the end of WandaVision. It was almost like she was a different character, and essentially, she kind of was, and that's the problem. Phases 1 to 3 used cameos and interconnectedness to display character development, and I think the biggest reason Phase 4, and now 5, are falling flat is because that seems to not be a priority anymore. While we may be seeing the same characters now appear in multiple shows and movies, their appearances don't feel like continuations as much as points and nods to the audience for the sake of the current story and not the overall arc of the MCU. The purpose and deliberateness feels gone. as does the sense that this is all building to the next big event, which then begs the question of why we should get excited when some version of a character from a different movie shows up in this one anymore. Seriously, in Phase 4, what is the difference narratively between Captain Marvel showing up at the end of Miss Marvel and that stupid Pietro Boner bait and switch in the middle of WandaVision? Both were recognizable characters from other stories that share fans, and the arrival of that character should have had big implications, but in both cases, it was done just for the audience to get excited and then not have it lead to anything more than a "hey, look who it is" moment. When it comes to the crossovers and cameos, the characters' places in the big story doesn't seem to be the priority anymore. Iron Man from 2008, at the start of his journey, likely doesn't sacrifice himself to save the universe if not for having to make the sacrifice play in the first Avengers movie. And we watch him grow into the empathetic mentor hero he becomes when he appears in the Spider-Man movies. Those appearances are key to showing his change as a character, and every time we see him, even if it's just for a scene, we know that it's another step forward in his development. The character crossovers and appearances post-Endgame do not feel this way at all, and Wanda's post-WandaVision appearance in Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness is the quintessential example of this. The character path that Wanda is on at the end of WandaVision is harrowing and complex and deals with her grief in a frank and bold way. She's learned she can't visit her grief on innocent bystanders just because she's in pain, but she has a long way to go before she's okay again. WandaVision ended, and we got a little teaser of her using the Darkhold to find her children, and after that bold character exploration that we got, I genuinely was intrigued to see where this character would go next in Multiverse of Madness. She was clearly being set up to slip again and take on a villain role, and I think that would have worked fine as another phase in her recovery journey if that version of the character had been written with what she'd been through in WandaVision in mind. The path to recovery from serious trauma is never a straight line that always points upward. There are peaks and valleys, and even when you reach an okay new normal, that journey is never fully done. I was really looking forward to seeing what that next phase of Wanda's journey was going to look like, given what she'd just gone through by the end of WandaVision. And a complicated, justified heel turn by this character would have been a fascinating villain to watch come up against Doctor Strange. Unfortunately, her appearance in Multiverse of Madness seemed to have little or no regard for where she had just come from in her character arc. While she was scary as hell, and Elizabeth Olsen crushed it, it didn't feel like a real continuation of the character's story at all. Sam Raimi even went on record saying he hadn't watched WandaVision before taking on Multiverse of Madness, and that is a damn shame. What we got was a scary, one-note Wanda who was doing all this just because she was sad she didn't have her kids anymore. And not only did this ruin her arc and burn the development we've been invested in, it made her a boring, one-note villain on top of it. Her portrayal in Multiverse of Madness prioritized the needs of that particular story over Wanda's arc and over moving the MCU's narrative forward. Whoever's responsible for keeping track of these character arcs and where we are in their stories, looking at you, Kevin, took their eye off the ball, and here we are. What I'm getting at here is that even if all of the outings in Phase 4 had been as inconsistent as what we got, with the few extreme highs of WandaVision, Loki, and No Way Home, and the low lows of things like Eternals, Moon Knight, or Thor Love and Thunder, I think we'd still be able to look back at Phase 4 as a relative success if we'd felt like we were watching chapters of one cohesive story. But nothing about what we got felt connected, and in that disconnect, it was very hard to remain invested or want to look ahead at how these threads might one day coalesce. Because honestly, what threads? Would a more consistent Wanda portrayal in Multiverse of Madness have saved Phase 4 on its own? Probably not. But showing the audience that character consistency was still a priority would have gone a long way to make the whole phase feel worth turning into show to show and movie to movie. The kicker is, it actually wouldn't have taken much story-wise to make the Wanda in Multiverse of Madness feel like she'd just gotten there from where she left off in WandaVision. And the fact that they left those beats out is so perfectly illustrative of how character consistency and development are not the priority for the MCU post-Endgame. She could have easily been a layered and compelling villain in Multiverse of Madness, similar to Killmonger in Black Panther, if the story had just taken a little time to show us how she got there. She had gotten a taste of what life was like with her children, and, while she knew she couldn't do to people what she did in WandaVision, it would have been very believable that she became so fixated on the life she could have had that she turned to the corrupting influence of the Darkhold to get it. The best villains are ones whose motivations make sense, but the reason they're the villains is that those motivations stand in direct conflict with the protagonist's objectives. By giving Wanda that thread of continuation from WandaVision and showing her choice to use the powers of the Darkhold to get what she wanted despite knowing or being shown that it wouldn't work out for anyone, that would have made it feel like this was the same Wanda from WandaVision and that we really were seeing the next, ill-advised phase of her journey. Had we been shown Wanda choosing to use the Darkhold because it was the only chance she felt she had to see her children again, choosing to break bad for the sake of some peace after all that trauma, we would have believed her as a villain and been sympathetic to her plight, which would have made it even easier to root for Doctor Strange to set her right and point her back on the path towards redemption, since it was his movie after all. If we get the same movie we got now, with just that bit of prologue or exposition thrown in, I think it would have gone a long way to saving her character arc and possibly Phase 4 as a whole. But we didn't, so it doesn't. Avengers Endgame was so satisfying because we got to see the long-awaited climax of a single 20-plus movie story that we watched build up and got truly invested in. I understand that the goal was likely to try something different in Phase 4, but taking away that experience of every movie and show that you were watching being part of a full whole makes the audience ask, why bother? If it's not building to something and it's barely the same character each time, why do I need to tune in to every single thing you put out? I care about these characters, and at this point the MCU is kind of saying, don't bother caring about this legacy character, just see this cool thing they're doing right now. Don't worry about how they got there or what this might mean for the future chapters of the story, just focus on this. Now, as I'm recording this, I actually just saw Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, and I can confirm that it does not fall into this trap. It was actually really good, but it also served as a self-contained send-off for a past arc that was now complete, and it made itself clear that it was not building to anything further in the broader MCU narrative. For now, I'll just end this by saying that regardless of what happens in the next big team-up Avengers movie in 2025, character consistency from appearance to appearance needs to be more of a priority in that buildup. And Earth 616 Wanda deserves the possibility to have her arc continued and corrected towards something like a redemption. Otherwise, why should we care? Thank you all so much for tuning in to this second ever video. If you've made it this far, please do go ahead and give a like and a subscribe if you haven't already. If I get enough subscribers, maybe I can get Doug out from under the table. No, but seriously, I appreciate you watching this far, and I'd love to hear a comment about what you think about what I said here. Would character consistency have been enough to redeem Phase 4? Is there any way to save Wanda's arc, or at this point is she just done? How should they handle how should they have handled Wanda's post Endgame or post WandaVision arc in a way that could have kept her sympathetic? Is there any hope for her in future installments? What should Doug and I discuss on this channel next? I'd love to get into all of it with all of you in the comments and in the next videos. But until then, tail slating.